thanks for tuning in on this. It took me a while, and I've been thinking about this subject for a few days now, and that's primarily because of the heating up of the subject of the quote caravan at the Mexican border, and the 5,000 or 7,000 people or whatever that made that 1,000-mile trek from Central America through Mexico to Tijuana and a couple other places. I have to say that the subject of secure borders is absolutely a legitimate thing for the president of any country in the United States to pay attention to, because any country that cannot protect its border is not a country. It's just a group of people waiting to be invaded by somebody else. And what I mean by invaded, I mean by foreign armies. Now, of course, the United States is not in that situation, and it really pisses me off to hear to hear this current president using the words invasion like that and couching his rationale. Even though he is correct in the focus, and based on the law, most of those 7,000 or however many that are coming up here are just wrong. And I'm going to explain why. So international law recognizes the notion of immigration. That means people who live in another country who want to go to a different country to live in or visit. So immigration is like this big bucket. There's legal immigration and there's illegal immigration. People can come to visit as tourists, a short term. They're not immigrating, they're visiting. However, if they intentionally try to overstay their visa for the purpose of remaining in this country, they are now an illegal immigrant. Their intent was to stay here and they did it illegally. Okay? Not something subject to the death penalty, but hey, they need to go home and get back in line and follow the rules. Okay? There is illegal immigration where a person just anywhere goes across the border without following the entry procedures for a particular country, and now is in that country illegally trying to stay. Now that happens in every country around the world. So every country has an illegal immigration issue. Some are big, some are little. The EU, they're in deep kimchi. But it's a bed that they made themselves. I'll come back to that when we talk about our Mexican border in a minute. So those are the two areas. Now within legal immigration, that is legal way to get into a country, you can do it again by applying to become a permanent person, or you can be a refugee, and your refugee status may result in you going to a third country or a country next to yours for the purpose of escaping really bad stuff, and I'll talk about what those are in a minute. Or, by the way, you can only get refugee status while you are outside a country. You can't come into a country and then be declared a refugee. It doesn't work that way. So you're outside a country and you want to get in because, and I'll give you what the reasons are, you can, because you're outside, be called a refugee, and you're going to go from your home country to another country. Asylum is different. Similar but different. Asylum says, I have come into your country either through a port of entry, that is, I got off a plane, walked across the bridge in Tijuana, whatever, and I don't have any papers or anything. I haven't, and they stop me and they detain me, and I say I'm requesting asylum. Then I better say because there's ways to do that. And we'll come and talk about the asylum part. But asylum seekers are inside the country, right? Now, where there's this pushing and shoving between the president and the court system and others, our law says if a person crosses our border, they can request asylum, whether it's through a port of entry or another location. Now, what the president has tried to do is say, well, I don't like that, and come up with some edict that says, well, only ports of entry. Well, he's not a dictator, and he can't, that's the law. He can't make law because he doesn't like the law, right? So, unfortunately, once a person crosses our border and they request asylum, they can't be kicked out. That's international law. And so how do you deal with that? Well, let me explain what the criteria are, and there's only 5 for being either a refugee, member from outside the country, or you come inside the country and you are asking for asylum. Here's what those are. For most countries and the United States, the person who is requesting refugee status from outside and or asylum, once they get inside the country, they must be able to show or be able to articulate very clearly that they are in fact being persecuted or under threat of being persecuted in the future, the near future, because of one or more of 5 things. The first is race, and this is government persecution, by the way. Government persecution, keep that in mind. Race, religion, their nationality, okay? Their political opinion. So they are being persecuted because they are in opposition to the existing government, for example. They can request asylum, become a refugee, either one. And then last, be a member of a particular social group, which is kind of a big bucket. But this is where women who are under threat of the sex trafficking or honor killing or are trying to escape female genital mutilation, those are still being argued by immigration lawyers around the world to try to deal with that. Those are the 5 things, period. Now what gets me spun around the axle is people coming up to our border, coming in legally or illegal, and then saying, you ought to let me in because I want a better life. I want a better job. My economic situation is better in your country than where I am. My response to that is fuck you. One of the 5, nope, don't hold up your baby. Don't hold up your baby. Don't show me a dying baby because they were in a boat and the boat capsized. I don't care. One of the 5 things, not one of the 5 things, go home because you're not coming in. Now, that's harsh, but that's the law. And that, by the way, that is the way it is, has been, and should continue to be. No one should have it in their head that they can come and demand to come into your country or any country because they don't like the situation they're in where they are. And, oh, by the way, a situation that's going on in their country where they could move inside their country and be out of harm's way, sorry, that's what they need to do. There are gangs. Sucks to be you. There's drug cartels. Tough, right? You have gangs. Gangs don't constitute reason to try to force your way through asylum or refugee status into someone else's country. Nowhere in the world is that the case. Now, that is just the way it is, and I totally support that. Now, if you use that criteria against the 5 or 7,000, how many are on the border, most of them would have to be turned away. Now, the problem is this. How do you process? Because remember, once a person says, I'm asking for asylum, then there's a process, there's due process, by the way, for the person to state their case in front of an immigration judge, a lawyer, judge. They have their conversation, they have proof or not. If they don't have proof, they get to go back home. If they have proof, they get to stay in the country. That is very rare that asylum is granted. I mean, you see what I'm saying? Now, I'm okay with asylum, but it has to meet the 5 criteria. A couple of good examples of persecution under the 5 criteria. One group are the Uyghurs. I don't know how to spell it, but the Uyghurs in China. The Uyghurs are Muslim, and the Chinese have been trying to do ethnic cleansing of that group forever, right? And the Uyghurs are trying to fight back inside of China in the geographic areas in which they live, and so there's a little mini civil war-ish thing going on over there. But because they're being persecuted by the Chinese government because of their religion and their nationality and their geography, they qualify for asylum, and if they can get out of China, they qualify for refugee status if they can get to a second country. The other group are the Rohingya. The Rohingya are also Muslim, and they're being persecuted by the Myanmar Buddhists. Yeah, the Buddhists there. Religious war, and the Rohingya are being persecuted because of their national. Actually, they have been given no national status, and their religion, and their race. So they certainly qualify. And by the way, I've worked with the refugee resettlement community for several years, both during resettlement and in public schools where I live. And we've had some Rohingya get to the United States, and some Uyghurs get to the United States, you know. And I'm cool with that. I'm cool with that. I'm not a supporter of Islam, but I'm not a supporter of ethnic cleansing of people either, you know, so I'm a little conflicted that way. But those are 2 excellent examples in today's world. And before that, in my military time, it was after the Vietnam War. We were trying to get some of the Vietnamese from being boat people and dying, you know, trying to get away from the North Vietnamese, and some Cambodians from the Khmer Rouge. Those are another examples of persecution and that kind of thing. One of the things that complicates this whole subject are some things that have developed both in Europe, in the EU, and in Latin America here in the Western Hemisphere. In the EU, when they created the EU, they created the ability for people within the EU countries to move freely about the EU. In other words, without being restricted at borders. Their refugee law and their asylum law said, now here you have this big bucket of countries, and once somebody hit one here, they requested asylum, they are free to move about the cabin. They are free to move from one country to another without restriction until they get to the place that they think they want to live in. So what happened? They leave Tunisia from South Africa, they hit Italy, and they go right for Germany, right for France, and right for the Nordic countries, which happen to be the richest countries in the EU. You see what I'm saying? That's something that the EU, that's the bed they laid in, and they had this massive migration of people, most of whom were looking for better jobs, more money. Some of whom were fleeing war in Syria. Imagine what would happen if our border was next to Syria. Or like the EU. So let's talk about Latin America. So the Organization of American States decided, okay, we're going to create the ability for people within the 12, there's 12 countries that are party to this, and Mexico is one of them, which is why they really could not stop the people coming from the Central American countries to them and through them. They couldn't stop that because they have an agreement with the other 11 countries. The United States is not a signatory to that agreement. So, bada bing, the caravan or the migrating people get stopped cold at our border. Thank goodness we didn't sign that, or we wouldn't be able to, they could come right into the United States just like what was happening in the EU. So, because of agreements in Latin American countries, they could not really stop these people from going from one country to another and getting here. What does that mean for us? Well, someone needs to educate these people to stop saying the words, I want to come to America to have a better life. Oh, cool. Go get in line. Go get in line. Don't come jamming my door because you want a better life. If you don't meet the 5 requirements for refugee or asylum status, go the fuck home. It's that simple, right? It's not complicated. And for those of you who think you qualify, right, you're going to need an attorney because you're going to go up against an immigration, not up against, you're going to have to stand in front of an immigration judge and state your case, most of which are denied. The problem we have is not that we need to build a wall. Right? Now, some of the existing physical barriers that we have, especially in Southern California and some areas of Texas, could use a little spiffing up, right? Both with physical hardness and some technology. But that's not the real solution, because the places where people can walk across the border now are so deadly that bodies pile up in the desert. You know, it's just like the boats sinking in the Mediterranean, you know. More than half of those people over there who try to leave Northern Africa to get to Europe die. They just die, you know, trying to make the trip. And, you know, I'm okay with that. You know, you're trying to force somebody. If you want to be a refugee and you want to have asylum, there are ways to do that. And they're well known. And there are people that can help folks get that done. Now, on our southern border, by the way, we have illegal folks coming in containers from China, Russians coming through Canada. I mean, we got folks coming through our borders from all kinds of places. To focus on the southern border, I think, is a bit disingenuous. But that's where the conversation is. The rules are the same. At this point, we have no obligation at all to allow anyone to come from that country into our country. And when the president says I can close the borders, he absolutely can. That's going to piss off hundreds of thousands of people who live in Mexico and work here, or live here and work in Mexico, right? I mean, the trade and the inconvenience would be crazy, but you could do that. Now, I think that the Mexicans are saying to the Central American people, you know, we kind of like had enough of you. We got our own problems with poverty and economic well-being. We don't need more of you to add to our problem. And I think that's kind of the conversation that's going on in Mexico right now, in Tijuana. I think Mexico will handle that. What I hope we don't do is agree in an uncontrolled way to let 5 or 7,000 people in without having a way to process them through the asylum system, if that's what they're looking for, process them as refugees. Now if they do that, they got to stay in Mexico in a refugee camp. Yeah, that's how it works. And Mexico has said they're not going to do that, because that would make them a third country refuge, and they don't want to do that. So it would be economically feasible, way more feasible, for us America, to say, how many buses do you need? How many aircraft do you need? Because we got some big airplanes, and we'll just land them, put them on a plane, and we'll fly them back to someplace else. And we have done that in other places, by the way. Right? The problem is, those people are not going to make a 1,000-mile trip again. Not readily. Not readily. Another part of the issue is we don't have enough immigration judges to process a lot of people in a short period of time, which means that Mexico is going to have to leave them there in Mexico, because we're not going to let them in. And that's kind of where the argument is now. So most of the people in the caravan are wrong. The president is correct in focusing on the issue. I think his words are screwed up. I think some of his actions are not well thought out. But in terms of the law, except for his view that people must go through a port of entry. Now, until Congress changes that law, he doesn't have a leg to stand on. Which brings me back to the need for more immigration judges, so we can widen the pipe, so we can get more people processed through. Now, once they come into the country, if they're allowed to come into the country that way, then how do we track them to make sure they don't disappear? Which ends up being an issue that a lot of people talk about, and the president uses the term catch and release. It's really not that. You know, it's just that, I mean, we can't lock people up who are seeking asylum. I mean, that's against international law. It's immoral, and that's just the wrong thing to do. Okay. So I tried not to make this a rant, because I didn't want it to be a rant. I rambled just a little bit, but the law is fairly clear, and as you all go about your thinking on the subject, take a breath for a minute and think about the refugee, asylum, what the 5 rules are. You know, we follow international law to the degree we need to, and no one has the right to force their way into another country because they want a better life. They want a better job. They can make more money someplace else. That's not part of the 5. So with that, forward this if you think it's good enough. If you haven't, subscribe, please do. Hit the bell down below, don't forget that one. And thanks for watching. Carry on.